Hey there, wargamers, hobbyists, and painters. Justin the Arm Painter here from Death or Designs, and today I've got something special to share with you guys. The guys over at spraygunner.com were kind enough to send me their no-name brand air compressor. That's right, no-name brand air compressor to run through the gauntlets. We're going to be doing a product review today, and in addition to doing the pros and cons and comparing it to Old Faithful here that we've been using for years, I'm actually going to be using this on some miniatures so we can see how it works in action. Specifically, I want to kind of gauge how loud it is, if it gets hot, if it sputters, things of that nature. First and foremost today, let's start off by talking about the price of each one of these products. The Sparmax 2000 here is going to come in at about $290, $300, give or take, and the no-name brand air compressor is going to come in at around $120, and at the time of filming this video, spraygunner.com has this for $110. So that's going to give you kind of a basis on the value and what we are comparing here. So the first thing I noticed when I opened up this compressor, other than the packaging, which was, well, I don't think this is going to get damaged in transit, and if it does, you would know because the box is going to be mangled up and destroyed. But the first thing I did notice was that the regulator was mounted to the side of the air tank. Now this is pretty standard for most air compressors, but that is one point for me that I'm a little spoiled with. The TC2000 comes with a hose that connects the regulator to the compressor so that I can mount the regulator to the table, so no matter where I'm painting I can have that at arm's reach, so when I'm changing airbrushes or changing paints I can adjust the PSI on the fly. Now if you're putting this on your desk, you can adjust the PSI on the fly as well. It's not a big deal, but for me I like to have my air compressor on the floor, out of sight, out of mind, so I have maximum workspace. So I don't think that's going to be a deal breaker on this, but there's one thing that I really did like about the Sparmax that hopefully would not be a deterrent for me for this one. Another thing that's worth mentioning with the no-name brand air compressor is that what you're looking at is basically what comes in the box, with the exception of you will get an instructional manual, which is pretty standard. That's important to note because some compressors will come with hoses and adapters. When I picked up my Sparmax TC2000, it had a hose on it and adapters that would allow that hose to be modified to fit a variety of the major name brand airbrushes at the time. I'm pretty sure there was one in there for Badger because I was able to hook my hose right up, and I think there was 2 or 3 more. I believe one of them was Pache and the other one might have been Harder and Steinbeck. I'm not positive. I only own Badger airbrushes at this moment, so the fact I had that adapter in there allowed me to pick up that compressor and get going and painting immediately. Now, that's not an absolute deal breaker for this because this compressor does come in at a very affordable price, but be aware that it doesn't come with a hose, and you'll need to get one that fits your particular brand of airbrush, and you want to make sure that you pay particular note to the threading size on the side of this compressor and the thread size on your actual hose for your airbrush. You want to make sure that that's going to fit this, and if it doesn't, make sure you stop by the hardware store to get an adapter because you'd hate for you to pick up this air compressor and then want to sit down to paint, grab your hose, and then try and put it on here and it does not fit. To reinforce this point, I have one of my Badger airbrush hoses available, and looking at the thread sizes here, you can literally see when you put it up next to this one, it doesn't fit. It won't thread in. To rectify this issue, you want to get an adapter like this that will convert this smaller thread size to the larger one to allow this hose to attach right to this. This is pretty simple, goes right on there, and then all you have to do is hook up your hose and get to airbrushing. Now I would highly recommend that you don't just put this on here like I did. Pick up some thread tape so that you can make sure that you don't have any air leaks. It's usually not the end of the world, but it is a little bit frustrating when your compressor starts to run constantly because of air leaks. So that is one thing that you can do to prevent that from happening. Now, the size of adapter you may need will definitely differ based on the hose and airbrush that you have. This one happens to be a Badger, and this adapter does work. That being said, if you have a hose that you can get hooked up and it does fit and you don't even have to have an adapter, you could just go the other route and convert this end of it that hooks up to your airbrush to make sure it fits on this side. So now that we've addressed the hose and some of the pros and cons right out the gate in regards to what these come with, the thing that's next is for us to hook this up, get the hose on there, and start slinging some paint and see how it performs. So to get things started, I've gone ahead and put the TC2000 on the table next to the no-name brand air compressor. The first thing that I want to test though is how this compressor holds up to being on the table itself. The last thing you want to do is to have an air compressor running and shaking and wobbling your desk. So I want to see what kind of shake we're going to get out of this. If the shake and the wobble is too much, the next thing that I'd like to see is how long this tank tank is going to hold the air compared to how often the compressor actually has to run to fill it up, because that's going to mitigate how much shake and wobble you're going to have on your actual work surface. If we find that the compressor is running too often, even though it has a tank, we're going to turn off the compressor and see how long the tank will work before we have to turn the compressor back on to fill it up. So I think we've got some versatility here, but we're going to give it a shot. I've got the TC2000 here because I want to be able to also compare and contrast the actual volume level or the sound that these compressors output. If you're in your own house, on your own property, the sound of your compressor may not be anything that you're too concerned with. You may have a spare room, or it may just be you alone as a bachelor or bachelorette and you're painting and you don't care. But if you happen to be in an area like a college dorm or somewhere where you're living like an apartment complex, the noise level that you're putting out may actually disturb your fellow neighbors through the wall here, so we want to kind of see and gauge how loud these are. To get things started, we're going to go ahead and release a little bit of pressure from the No Name brand to get it to kick off. I've already filled it up. That took about 45 seconds to a minute to fill the tank, but we're going to release some air and get this to trigger some sound so you guys can hear. So that's not an inconsiderable amount of sound. For me personally, it's not too bad, but I could see if this was constantly running and you had a neighbor next door that could hear it through the wall, this being annoying. I'd be curious to know how this is going to stack up to loud music, a TV, or a video game, but I could see where that might be a deterrent for some people. To give you guys a basis of comparison, we're going to go ahead and release some pressure off the Sparmax here, which is tankless, and I'll go ahead and see what kind of sound level it gets so you guys can compare. So that is definitely a little bit quieter, but it's going to run more frequently. So just by releasing a little bit of air out of this, it kicks back on immediately. If I use the airbrush, which is hooked up to the No Name brand, and I'm running some air through it right now, this is not kicked back on. The same cannot be said for the Sparmax. It would have kicked back on by now and caused it to be making more noise. So you may get a short burst of noise very frequently, or a long burst of noise infrequently. So those are two things you guys should consider when you're looking for an air compressor. Now, if you're familiar with our channel, you know we like to paint minis, and that's what we do. So this would not be a good product review if we weren't showing this thing in action on some miniatures. So here I've got a whole bunch of Star Wars Legion minis that we need to get painted up here out of the shop, so I have something to play with in some of our games. So we're going to be running this thing through the gauntlet and see how it handles a long painting session of laying down primer and base coat on all the miniatures I have here on my desk. And it's more than 5, I just grabbed those for reference. To get things started here, I've got all my clone troopers lined up, and we're going to lay down some base coats. Also curious to see how this is going to respond while we're running paint through it, how often it's going to run, and if it's too shaky. If it is, I will mention it on the video. If not, I will give you guys periodic updates as I'm working on this. So I'm not going to make you watch me spray each and every one of these guys, but I am going to pop in for periodic updates and let you know kind of how long I've been working on them and what I'm going through. So with that being said, we're going to load up our airbrush and get some paint going. The paint we're going to be using today is Stynylrez Gray Primer. Spraygunner.com also does sell this, so check out the prices for that there. They, however, currently do not have any Minotaur paint in stock, which I will also be using. And for you guys out there that aren't familiar, this is really great stuff for working on your hobby miniatures and stuff like that. But at the very least, the Stynylrez is really good to pick up, and if you haven't tried it out, it's fantastic. I know some people out there that are in the miniatures world like to use the Vallejo Surface Primer, which is not a bad product, but the wait time on that, which I think is typically about 24 hours before you can comfortably paint over the top and do stuff with it, is a little bit of a hurdle to get over. With the Stynylrez, you spray it, when it's dry, you're generally ready to go. So on that note, let's go ahead and crack open some gray primer and get to slinging some paint. I'm going to start off as usual and spraying a little bit down here. Officially the first spray from this air compressor, so we'll see how this goes. And there is the first time it has triggered. It has been sitting here. It might have a slow leak because I might not have gotten the threads taped up very well. That being said, it's the first time it has triggered, and we just got our first spray in, but now the tank is ideally full. We're going to go ahead and try and get some work done and see how long we go between actual refills. So here we go. Now I've currently got I've got the compressor's regulator set to around 30 psi. We're laying down some primer, so generally I like to sling a lot of paint. And there was our second refill, so I got a feeling that there is a little bit of a leak on this because it should not be filling up that frequently. That might be something on my end. So now that's happened a few times, let's go ahead and cut the compressor off and see how long we can get on this tank before it has to start refilling. All right, so it looks like we got maybe about 5 minutes or so through this with the compressor off before I needed to turn it back on to get the tank filled back up. So like I said, we may have a slow leak here that could be operator error on my part. But we're going to go ahead and turn this back on and get all the base coats done on these models, and then I'll come back and let you guys know what to think about this over the long term. All right, so after about, what's that? Hour and a half or so of airbrushing, I've got the base coats down on these and the place that I want them to be. In terms of how the airbrush performed, I didn't get any sputtering, no water through the hose, which is good. It did kick on quite a bit, so it was a little bit loud. I ended up putting it on the floor, obviously. But once I got into it, I kind of just started to tune it out because I'm used to the background noise of a compressor running nonstop. And I could have sped up this process by a long shot if I had pre-primed these, but I wanted to do all of this at one time so I could really stress test the airbrush. So I nearly constantly had that thing running. And if I'm honest, I had more issues with the airbrush clogging or sputtering or giving me issues than it actually did with the compressor. I also chose to work on white, which is not the easiest color to put on miniatures as well. So kind of a double whammy for me there. But I'm reasonably happy with the way that these guys have turned out. The paints worked out well. I actually tried some Vallejo Model Color for the first time, or Model Air rather, which was really nice. And I'm pretty pleased with how the compressor handled the long duration. So, all right, so now we've got our base coats down on these miniatures and we've ran this air compressor through the stress test. It's time for some pros and cons and my final thoughts. After all is said and done, I think I probably spent about an hour and a half of constant airbrush use on this compressor. I mentioned previously in this review I was concerned with how frequently the compressor kicked on and that there might actually be an air leak somewhere present. Now I've totally identified where that is, and that's completely on me, and that is on the converter here that hooks up to the regulator to allow my hose to mount. Now I did use some thread tape, but in hindsight maybe getting a little bit tighter or perhaps skipping the thread tape and using some blue Loctite might have been a good idea. I wouldn't recommend using red Loctite because I wouldn't want something to be permanently affixed. The blue Loctite I think is considered semi-permanent, so you can pop the mount back off if for some reason you wanted to switch over to a different hose or a different brand. Now you may have noticed me also place my hand on top of this. After an hour and a half of constant use, this thing is barely warm to the touch. If you accidentally touch this or you have a child around, they are not going to burn themselves on this, at least not within the hour and a half range that I was using it. Based on how warm this is, I think it would take way more than that for this to ever get hot to a point where this might actually hurt you. Now, in terms of pros and cons, I will say that this thing is a little bit noisy, but if I had gotten the air leak addressed a little bit earlier on and actually got to use this without having to hear it kick on so frequently, it probably would not have been so bad. So I wouldn't put that as a 100% con because it was also partially my fault, but if you're worried about something putting off too much noise because you have people in the house with you, or you happen to be painting in a dorm or an apartment and you're worried about your roommates or people next door, that is one thing to consider. I think it's important to note, as we said previously in this video, that if you pick up this compressor and tank combo, that it is what you get right here. You're not going to get the converter for hoses or an adapter for the end of a hose or an actual hose. Now that may be considered a little bit of a con, but at the price point that this comes in at about 120 bucks, which right now it's at 110 I think on their website, I can live with that. You can spend some of the money you're saving on that to pick up a hose. They're not that expensive. So while that may be a little bit of a con because it's not a one-stop shop in terms of the box, you can pick up those products on their website and it's not that bad. While working on these miniatures, I did not run into any telltale signs of a cheap compressor. Some of those things might include bursts of air or water in the line, and that did not come up. If I'm honest with you, I had more issues with the airbrush than I actually did the compressor itself. The airbrush kept giving me some issues with speckling and clogging, and I spent a lot of time cleaning, but I wanted to get some practical hands-on use with this, and that's good because during a session you're not going to be constantly just spraying paint, you're going to be cleaning and moving around, and I did all of those things and it functioned flawlessly. Airbrush on the other hand, it did not. And my last note on the actual use of this, I did start with it on the table first and then moved it onto the floor. It was running quite frequently, but it wasn't shaking and bobbling so much that it was actually going to disrupt my painting. So if you're on a sturdy desk and you really needed to have this up there with you, you want to have quick access to the regulator, this is going to do just fine, especially if you have it set up to where there's no air leak and it's not running as frequently as it did for me. Finally, I did compare this heavily to my experience using the Sparmax TC2000 because that is my bread and butter. It's what I've been using for the last, 8 years or so. and this has performed quite well. The Sparmax is going to come in at right around $300 at the Spray Gunner website, and this particular no brand name spraygunner.com compressor is coming in at currently $110, $120 if it was not on sale. This is coming in at almost a third of the price of the Sparmax, and I honestly really do like it. It is a little bit loud. That's probably the only major complaint I can give you, but as someone whose first air compressor came from Harbor Freight and it was a little rinky-dink cheapo one that still set me back between $80 and $100, this thing at a similar price range with a tank is much better. My first air compressor ended up dying on me very quickly. It ran constantly, it overheated, and it started spurting water, even though I had a moisture trap on the actual compressor and then one on the actual airbrush itself. It was horrendous. This comes in at barely more money than that and functions flawlessly by comparison. If you're looking to get into airbrushing, or perhaps you just want to upgrade your current compressor, maybe you had one like I had from Harbor Freight that was cheap and didn't function well, you can't go wrong with the no-name brand compressor from spraygunner.com. As a few final notes, I really would like to drive home that if you happen to pick up one of these, make sure you do your homework, find out what kind of converter you're going to need to make your hose fit, get some thread tape, or get some Loctite so you can make sure you don't have the air leak like I had. If you haven't already, make sure you check out spraygunner.com, see what deals they're running, and see if they have something that works for you. If you happen to have any questions about this rig that I haven't answered in this review, make sure you sound off in the comments below. I'll be happy to try and answer those for you. Additionally, if there's anything else you'd like to see me review in the future, make sure you let me know in the comments below as well. I'm in the market to pick up a couple of new airbrushes, and I'd like to know what you guys might like to see me work with. If you haven't already, make sure you like this video, smash that subscribe button, and ding the little bell so you get alerts when we put up new content. You may not know this, but I also live stream several days a week over on Twitch, where I work on miniatures, hang out with hobbyists like yourself, and try and provide answers to questions you might have in regards to painting, and generally just try and entertain you. I'd like to end today's video by thanking spraygunner.com for sending me this product so that I can do an unboxing as well as product review series of videos. If you guys haven't checked them out yet, make sure you check out their website, be on the lookout for their Black Friday deals, and as always, keep on painting, and I'll see you guys next time.